James Parker stood at the kitchen window of his new home, sipping his morning coffee as he watched birds hop around his backyard. After 20 years of running his own property company, working 80-hour weeks, and living in a fancy downtown apartment that felt more like a hotel than a home, this quiet spot in Oakwood Estates felt like heaven. The neighborhood looked like something from a TV show: neat houses with perfect lawns, flower beds bursting with colors, and sidewalks where kids rode bikes after school. James had first noticed Oakwood Estates 3 years ago when driving through town. Something about the place caught his eye, not just how pretty it was, but how it could be even better with the right touch. That day, James had called his business partner Tom. "I think I found our next project," he'd said. Within 6 months, through a series of quiet business deals that nobody in the neighborhood even noticed, James became the owner of the entire Oakwood Estates development. Every house, every street, every blade of grass technically belonged to him. But James wasn't ready to announce himself. "I want to know what it's really like to live there first," he told Tom when they signed the final papers. "I'll move in as a regular homeowner. No special treatment. Let's see how the place runs before we make any changes." Tom thought James was crazy. "You own 53 homes worth over $30 million, and you're going to pretend to be just another resident? That's nuts." James had just smiled. Best way to find out what needs fixing is to experience it yourself. Now, 3 months after moving in, James was enjoying his simple routine. He planted flowers, nodded hello to neighbors walking their dogs, and blended in perfectly. His new neighbors had no idea that the quiet man in the blue house on Pine Street was actually their landlord. The doorbell rang, interrupting James's peaceful morning. Through the peephole, he saw a woman with steel gray hair pulled back in a tight bun, wearing a powder blue cardigan with a clipboard hugged to her chest. Her lips were pressed into a thin line as she rang the bell again, more insistently this time. James opened the door with a friendly smile. "Good morning." "Mr. Parker," the woman said without returning his smile. "I'm Margaret Wilson, president of the Oakwood Estates Homeowners Association. I've noticed you've moved in without attending our welcome orientation." Her voice had that tone that reminded James of his strictest grade school teacher, the one who gave detention for untied shoelaces. "I've been meaning to stop by," James lied politely. In truth, he had been avoiding the HOA office specifically because he didn't want anyone looking too closely at his paperwork. Spring arrived in Oakwood Estates, bringing with it chirping birds and blooming flowers. James had settled into a comfortable routine in his new home, often sitting on his back porch with a cup of coffee, watching the neighborhood come to life. One Saturday morning, James hung a small wooden bird feeder from the oak tree in his backyard. He filled it with premium birdseed and smiled as chickadee and finches quickly discovered the new food source. Their cheerful songs filled his yard, creating the peaceful atmosphere he'd been hoping for when he moved here. The peace lasted exactly 4 hours. "Mr. Parker," Margaret's voice cut through the tranquil birdsong like a chainsaw. She stood at the edge of his property, pointer finger aimed at the bird feeder like she was identifying a criminal in a lineup. "That is a direct violation of HOA rules." James set down his gardening tools and walked over. "Good afternoon, Margaret. Beautiful day, isn't it?" Margaret wasn't interested in small talk. Section 7, Paragraph 4 strictly prohibits bird feeders. They attract pests and create mess. "Actually," James said calmly, "I believe that rule applies to front yards only. This is my backyard, which isn't visible from the street." Margaret's face flushed slightly. "The spirit of the rule applies to all outdoor areas." "That the letter of the rule specifies front yards," James replied. "I've read the entire rule book very carefully." Margaret pulled out her phone and snapped a photo of the offending bird feeder. "You'll be receiving a written notice about this. I suggest you remove it immediately." James just nodded politely as she marched away, her shoes leaving little indents in his perfectly maintained lawn. Sure enough, that evening a formal violation notice appeared in James's mailbox. It cited Section 7, Paragraph 4, and demanded removal of the bird feeder within 48 hours, or a $50 fine would be assessed. James read the notice, then set it aside. The bird feeder stayed exactly where it was. 2 days later, Margaret returned with a second notice, this one with $50 fine stamped in bright red letters across the top. "Your bird feeder is still up," she said when James opened the door. "Yes, it is," James agreed pleasantly. "Would you like to come in? I just made some fresh lemonade." Margaret looked startled by the invitation but stepped stiffly into his living room. James poured 2 glasses of lemonade and handed her one, which she accepted reluctantly. "I've taken the liberty of making a copy of the HOA regulations," James said, pulling out a neatly marked binder. "If you'll look at Section 7, Paragraph 4, you'll see it clearly states no bird feeders are permitted in front yard areas as they may attract unwanted pests." Margaret scanned the page, her lips moving slightly as she read. Her frown deepened. "As you can see," James continued, "my bird feeder is in the backyard, not the front yard. It's fully compliant with the written rules." Margaret set her untouched lemonade down. "Well, the spirit of the rule." "I believe we should follow the rules as written," James interrupted gently. "Otherwise, how could any resident know what's actually allowed?" Margaret's face turned an interesting shade of pink. This is, she couldn't seem to find the right words. Finally, she stood up straight and adjusted her cardigan. "The rules will need to be amended to close this loophole." "Of course," James said, "but until then, I'm not in violation, am I?" Margaret left without answering, the violation notice crumpled in her fist. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood about James standing his ground. His next-door neighbor, an older gentleman named Frank, peeked over the fence the following day. "Heard you gave Margaret a run for her money," Frank said with a chuckle. "Nobody's done that in years." James shrugged. "I just followed the rules." "That's what drives her crazy," Frank said. "She's used to people being too scared or too busy to check what the rules actually say. You're using her own weapon against her." That evening, James noticed 3 new bird feeders had appeared in nearby yards. A small rebellion was brewing in Oakwood Estates. For the next week, James watched as Margaret stomped through the neighborhood with her clipboard, documenting the sudden outbreak of bird feeders. She couldn't find anyone since they were all in backyards, following the letter of the law. James smiled to himself. This was just the beginning. If Margaret wanted a battle of wits, he was more than ready to play. The April showers brought May flowers to Oakwood Estates, and James decided it was time for a bigger project. The plain grass lawn in front of his house had never impressed him. It was just like every other lawn on the street, boring and thirsty for water. He'd always believed that yards should have personality, just like the people who lived in the homes. Early one Saturday morning, James drove to the local garden center and loaded his car with native plants, decorative rocks, and bags of mulch. By noon, he had mapped out his new garden design: drought-resistant plants that would need very little water, arranged in beautiful clusters with a small pathway winding through them. "What in heaven's name are you doing?" Margaret's voice shattered his peaceful planning. She stood at the edge of his driveway, her face a mixture of horror and anger as she surveyed the torn-up lawn and piles of plants waiting to be installed. "Good morning, Margaret," James said cheerfully, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Just doing some landscaping." "This is completely unacceptable." She was clutching her HOA rulebook so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Section 12 clearly states that all front lawns must be maintained with standard turf grass. This wilderness you're creating violates every landscaping standard we have." James set down his shovel and smiled. "Would you like some iced tea? It's getting pretty hot out here." Margaret ignored his offer. "You need to stop this immediately and restore the lawn to its proper condition." "Actually," James said, pulling a folded paper from his back pocket, "I have the landscaping amendment right here. It was passed 5 years ago by the HOA board, when you were president, if I'm not mistaken." He handed her the document. The amendment clearly allowed for drought-resistant landscaping as an environmentally friendly alternative to traditional lawns. Margaret scanned the paper, her lips pressed so tightly they nearly disappeared. This was meant for the back section of the development, not the main streets. "It doesn't specify that anywhere in the writing," James pointed out gently. "And given our area's water restrictions, I thought the HOA would appreciate a resident taking initiative to reduce water consumption, especially since the water bill for common areas has gone up 30% this year." Margaret's head snapped up. "How do you know about the HOA's water expenses?" James shrugged casually. "It was mentioned in last month's newsletter. I pay attention to the details." Margaret studied him for a long moment. "You're up to something, Mr. Parker. I don't know what your game is, but I'm watching you." "No game, Margaret. Just trying to be a good neighbor and follow the rules, all of them, not just the ones you prefer to enforce." After Margaret stormed off, James's neighbor Frank wandered over, whistling at the garden plans. "That's gonna look amazing," Frank said, "and it'll drive Margaret absolutely bonkers." "It's within the rules," James replied with a small smile. "Maybe so, but she's gonna find something else to get you on. That's how she operates. When she feels challenged, she doubles down." Frank was right. The very next day, James received a violation notice about his mailbox being half an inch too tall. The day after that, another notice claimed his house numbers weren't the approved font style. Then came warnings about his garbage can placement, the color of his garden hose, and even the pitch of his roof gutters. James carefully documented each complaint and responded with polite letters citing the exact wording of the rules, proving he was in compliance each time. He made a point of sending copies to the entire HOA board, not just Margaret. By the end of the month, his native plant garden was flourishing. Purple coneflowers, black-eyed Susans, and lavender created a tapestry of colors that attracted butterflies and hummingbirds. Neighbors would slow their walks to admire the transformation. Several even asked James for advice on creating their own water-saving gardens. Each new garden that appeared in the neighborhood was like a personal insult to Margaret, whose own perfectly manicured lawn required constant watering and chemical treatments to maintain. "You've started a revolution," Frank told James one evening as they watched a hummingbird hover among the flowers. "People are actually talking to their neighbors again, sharing plants and tips." "That was the plan all along," James replied. "Communities should bring people together, not just enforce rules that keep them apart." What neither of them saw was Margaret watching from across the street, making notes and formulating her biggest plan yet to put James Parker in his place once and for all. The monthly HOA meeting was scheduled for 7:00 p.m. in the Oakwood Estates Community Center. James arrived 15 minutes early and was surprised to find the room already packed. Usually, these meetings drew only a handful of residents, but tonight nearly every seat was filled. People whispered in small groups, the room buzzing with excitement. "What's going on?" James asked Frank, who had saved him a seat near the back. "Word got out that Margaret has something big planned," Frank whispered. "She's been telling everyone she's going to handle the Parker situation once and for all tonight." James raised his eyebrows but said nothing. He noticed several neighbors giving him encouraging smiles or thumbs-up signs. His quiet resistance against Margaret's rule had made him something of a local hero. At exactly 7:00, Margaret entered the room carrying a thick folder and her laptop. She was dressed more formally than usual in a navy blue blazer, looking like she was heading to court rather than a neighborhood meeting. The 4 other HOA board members followed her in, looking uncomfortable. "I call this meeting to order," Margaret announced, tapping her gavel sharply. "We have a full agenda tonight, but first, we need to address an ongoing situation that threatens the very fabric of our community." She clicked a button on her laptop and a large image appeared on the screen behind her, a photo of James's house. Item 1. The ongoing violations at 127 Pine Street, owned by James Parker. James sat quietly as Margaret launched into a 20-minute presentation, complete with before and after photos of his property, highlighted sections of the HOA rulebook, and graphs showing what she called declining property values since his landscaping changes. "As you can see," Margaret said, clicking to a slide with a red arrow pointing dramatically downward, "allowing this type of rule bending sets a dangerous precedent that could affect all our home values." What Margaret didn't mention was that 3 houses in Oakwood Estates had sold in the past month, all for well above asking price. The neighborhood was becoming more desirable, not less. Therefore, Margaret continued, the board needs to consider whether Mr. Parker's continued presence in our community is beneficial. I'm suggesting we explore options under Section 22 for persistent rule breakers. A murmur ran through the room. Section 22 was the HOA's nuclear option, the power to force a homeowner to sell their property after repeated violations. That seems extreme, one board member said hesitantly. Has Mr. Parker been given proper notice of all these alleged violations? 16 notices in the past month alone, Margaret said firmly. with no meaningful corrective action taken. James raised his hand politely. Margaret tried to ignore him, but another board member nodded in his direction. I believe Mr. Parker would like to respond. James walked to the front of the room carrying his own folder. Thank you for your thorough presentation, Mrs. Wilson. If I may, I'd like to address each point raised. For the next 10 minutes, James calmly went through each violation Margaret had cited, showing documentation proving he was in compliance with the actual written rules. He had brought copies for each board member and distributed them as he spoke. As for my native plant garden, James said, showing beautiful photos of the flowering plants that had replaced his lawn, it's fully compliant with the environmental amendment passed in 2018. And regarding property values, 3 homes have sold above asking price in the past month. Our neighborhood is thriving. He turned to face the residents rather than just the board. I believe in following rules, but I also believe in building a community where people want to live, where neighbors talk to each other instead of just reporting violations, where we work together to make Oakwood Estates better for everyone. Spontaneous applause broke out among the residents. Margaret's face turned an alarming shade of red. This is outrageous, she sputtered. You can't just come in here and turn everyone against years of established procedures. I'm not against procedures, James replied calmly. I'm against using rules to control people rather than to help them. One of the board members, a quiet woman named Helen who rarely spoke at meetings, cleared her throat. I move that we table discussion of Section 22 actions and instead form a committee to review our current rules for clarity and purpose. I second that motion, another board member quickly added. Margaret looked stunned as the motion passed with a 4-1 vote, with only Margaret opposing. As the meeting moved on to other business, Margaret leaned toward James and whispered, "This isn't over, Mr. Parker. Not by a long shot." James just smiled politely. "I'm looking forward to working together to improve our community, Margaret." But the look in her eyes told him this battle was about to get much worse before it got better. 2 weeks after the heated HOA meeting, James was enjoying his morning coffee on the front porch. His garden was in full bloom, attracting butterflies and hummingbirds. Several neighbors had started their own native plant gardens, creating patches of color throughout the once uniform neighborhood. The mail truck pulled up, and the carrier waved as he slipped an envelope into James's mailbox. James waved back and walked down to retrieve his mail, surprised to find a thick certified letter among the usual bills and flyers. Back on his porch, James opened the envelope and pulled out a formal-looking document with the Oakwood Estates HOA logo at the top. The heading read, "No Tie City of Inla and Ceylon Lion C and INTNT to INFOC Remedial Action." James read through the dense legal language with growing disbelief. The letter claimed he had committed persistent and willful violations of community standards and gave him 30 days to fix all problems or face escalating enforcement actions up to and including property lion and forced sale. At the bottom were 2 signatures, Margaret Wilson as HOA president and Thomas Blackwell as the representative of Oakwood Management Company. James had to smile at the irony. Thomas worked directly for him, managing the property that James secretly owned. She really went there, James muttered to himself, setting the letter aside. The situation had moved beyond a neighborhood squabble. Margaret was actually trying to force him out of his home. Just then his phone rang. It was Thomas Blackwell. "Boss, did you get the letter?" Thomas asked, sounding worried. "Margaret stormed into my office yesterday with this legal document she wanted me to sign. I tried to talk her out of it, but she threatened to have the HOA switch management companies if I didn't cooperate." "It's okay, Tom," James assured him. "Your signature doesn't really change anything, but it does show how far she's willing to go." "What are you going to do? Should we just tell her who you really are?" James thought for a moment. "Not yet. I want to see this through properly. Set up a meeting with our attorney for tomorrow morning. It's time to prepare for the endgame." Later that afternoon, James was trimming his hedges when he noticed an unfamiliar car parked across the street. A woman in a business suit stood taking photos of his house with a professional camera. "Can I help you?" James called out. The woman looked startled but quickly recovered. "Just doing some neighborhood assessment work," she answered vaguely before hurrying back to her car. Frank wandered over from next door. "That's the third person I've seen taking pictures of your house this week," he said. "What's going on?" James showed him the letter. Frank's eyes widened as he read it. "This is nuts. They can't force you to sell your house over some made-up violations." "Actually, they can try," James said. "The HOA does have that power, technically, but only if they can prove serious, documented violations that impact property values." Frank shook his head in disgust. "Margaret's gone too far this time. Half the neighborhood is changing their landscaping just like you did. Is she going to try to kick everyone out?" "I think this is personal," James replied. "She sees me as challenging her authority, and she can't handle it." The next morning, James spotted a county records office car pulling into his driveway. The driver delivered a large envelope with EVICT stamped across it in red letters. Inside was a packet of property documents that Margaret had requested, the complete ownership history of Oakwood Estates. James smiled to himself. Margaret was digging, trying to find anything she could use against him. What she would find instead would change everything. That evening, James received a call from a panicked Thomas. "Margaret just left my office," Thomas said, his voice shaking slightly. "She knows, boss. She found the property records showing your company owns the entire development. She was white as a sheet when she stormed out of here." James checked his watch. "How long ago?" "About 20 minutes. "Then I should expect a visitor any moment now," James said calmly. As if on cue, there was a pounding at his front door so forceful it seemed the wood might crack. "Time for the final act," James said to himself, straightening his shirt as he went to answer the door. The moment of truth had arrived, and James couldn't help but smile as he turned the doorknob. James opened his front door to find Margaret standing there, her usually perfect appearance noticeably disheveled. Her hair had escaped its tight bun in several places, and her face was flushed with a mix of anger and something else. Fear, perhaps. "Is it true?" she demanded without greeting, her voice shaking slightly. "Are you really the owner of Oakwood Properties LLC?" James stepped back and gestured for her to come inside. "Would you like some tea, Margaret? I think we have a lot to discuss." "I don't want tea," she snapped, but she stepped into his living room anyway. "I want to know if these documents are correct. Did you buy this entire development 3 years ago?" James nodded calmly. "Yes, I did. Please, sit down." Margaret remained standing, clutching a folder of papers so tightly her knuckles were white. "Why? Why would you move in here and pretend to be just another resident? Was this all some kind of sick game to make me look foolish?" "Not at all," James replied. "When I buy a property, I like to understand it from the inside before making changes. Living here as a regular homeowner gave me insights I couldn't get any other way." Margaret sank slowly onto the edge of the sofa. "So all this time, when I was giving you citations and fines, you were essentially trying to evict your own landlord," James finished with a small smile. "Ironic, isn't it?" Margaret's face paled. "Are you going to fire me from the HOA board? Are you going to change everything I've built here?" Before James could answer, his doorbell rang. He opened it to find 5 other HOA board members and about a dozen neighbors standing on his porch and spilling onto his lawn. Word travels fast in Oakwood Estates. Frank called out from the back of the group. "Is it true, James? Do you own the whole neighborhood?" James looked at all the curious faces and nodded. "Yes, it's true. Why don't you all come in? We might as well have this conversation together." Soon James's living room was packed with neighbors, some sitting on chairs, others standing along the walls. Margaret sat silently on the sofa, looking shell-shocked. "I bought Oakwood Estates 3 years ago because I saw potential here," James explained to the group. "Not just as a property investment, but as a true community. I moved in 6 months ago to experience life here firsthand before making any changes." "What kind of changes?" asked Helen, one of the HOA board members. "For starters, a more reasonable approach to the rules," James said. "Communities need guidelines, but they should bring people together, not drive them apart." He turned to Margaret. "You clearly care deeply about this neighborhood, Margaret. That dedication is valuable. But somewhere along the way, the rules became more important than the people they were meant to serve." Margaret looked down at her hands. "I just wanted everything to be perfect," she said quietly. When my husband died, keeping the neighborhood in order gave me purpose. James nodded understanding. There's nothing wrong with having standards. But punishment and control don't build community, shared purpose does. He addressed the whole room again. I'm proposing some changes. First, we'll revise the HOA guidelines to be clearer and more focused on what really matters. Second, we'll create more community spaces, a garden where everyone can grow vegetables, upgraded playgrounds, and monthly neighborhood events. The residents began nodding with enthusiasm. And what about the HOA board? Someone asked. We'll hold new elections, James said. Anyone who wants to serve can run, including Margaret, if she's interested in being part of this new approach. All eyes turned to Margaret, who looked up in surprise. You'd still want me involved? After everything? Your attention to detail and dedication could be incredibly valuable, James said sincerely, if you're willing to focus on building up rather than shutting down. A month later, the newly elected HOA board held its first meeting in the community center. James sat not at the head of the table, but as an advisor. Margaret was there too, now heading the newly formed garden committee, where her organizational skills were being put to positive use. Around the neighborhood, changes were already visible. More colorful gardens had replaced perfectly manicured but sterile lawns. Children played freely on front yards without fear of citations. Neighbors stopped to chat with each other instead of hurrying inside to avoid Margaret's patrols. And James finally had what he'd been looking for all along, not just a house, but a home in a real community where people looked out for each other. As for Margaret, she still carried a clipboard on her walks through the neighborhood, but now it contained notes about which plants were thriving and which neighbors might need help with their gardens. She'd found a better way to channel her love of order, and in the process, discovered that sometimes the most beautiful gardens aren't the most controlled ones, but the ones with room to grow wild.